The air in Eldermire was thick with silence. Not the silence of peace, but of absence, of a place long abandoned, yet never truly empty. The portal behind Shade and Katrina flickered briefly before collapsing, leaving them alone in the remains of what was once a thriving hub of trade and power. Now it was nothing but a graveyard. Towering archways stood shattered, their once intricate runes now cracked and lifeless. Buildings that had once been bustling with merchants and travellers had long since crumbled into skeletal remains, their stone walls blackened with the scars of fire. The air smelled of old ash, a scent that had no right lingering for 80 years, as if the ruin itself refused to let go of its own destruction. Katrina took a slow step forward, her boots crunching over glass-like shards of what had once been magical conduits. She reached out a hand, fingers brushing against the air where a portal once stood. Even now, she could feel the faintest tremor of unstable energy, like a wound refusing to close. Shade stood beside her, still as a shadow, his keen gaze scanning the ruins with practiced precision. The tattered banners of Draven's father, the former portal master, still clung stubbornly to the remains of a half-standing watchtower, their fabric faded, but not forgotten. The insignia, a ring of intertwining pathways, symbolizing Eldermire's role as a gateway between worlds, felt almost mocking now. Shade pressed 2 fingers to his talisman, activating the enchanted link back to Echo Division. Shade to workshop. We've arrived. No immediate hostiles, but... He hesitated, glancing at Katrina before continuing. Eldermire's worse than I expected. Magic here is unstable. The whole place feels... wrong. There was a brief pause before Dessera's voice crackled through the talisman. Understood. Any sign of the old portal structures? Katrina crouched beside the nearest rune-etched platform, running her fingers over its deep fractures. Whatever power had once thrived here had been ripped away violently. She shook her head. Ruined. If there was a way through, Draven made damn sure no one could use it again. Shade exhaled sharply. We'll move toward Draven's stronghold, check for any remaining activity. He adjusted the strap of his gear and motioned for Katrina to follow. Moving carefully, avoiding open ground, they made their way deeper into the ruins. Then, a flicker. Katrina stopped dead in her tracks. The shadows against the far wall of a ruined corridor shifted, too fluidly, too unnaturally. Shade saw it too. His instincts screamed a warning. Before he could react, the talisman link cut out. A sharp burst of interference rippled through the air, warping the edges of reality around them. The moment stretched unnaturally like time itself, was glitching. Shade clenched his jaw. Something was here. Then, the shadows settled, the air stilled. The disturbance was gone as quickly as it had come. Katrina exhaled, shoulders tense. Yeah, definitely unstable magic. Shade didn't reply immediately. He glanced down at the talisman, tapping it again. Nothing. Their link to Echo Division was completely severed. Shade and Katrina exchanged a glance, their instincts honed by experience, their silence speaking volumes. Without their link to Echo Division, they had to rely solely on each other, something neither found unsettling. Moving like spectres through the wreckage, they stayed low, using the broken remains of Eldermire's structures as cover. The deeper they moved, the more they could feel it, the unnatural hum of residual energy pressing in on them like the ghost of something long dead but unwilling to be forgotten. A ruined archway loomed ahead, leading to what had once been the inner district. Unlike the outskirts, this area had not been completely reduced to rubble. While fire and battle had ravaged much of Eldermire, here, the structures stood partially intact, though warped by whatever dark forces had swept through them all those years ago. Katrina placed a hand against a half-standing stone pillar, feeling the faint etchings of what had once been a rune of passage. Some of these look untouched, she murmured, tracing her fingers along the cracks. Shade studied the walls, his sharp eyes noting the subtle layering of magic that still clung to the ruins. The destruction had been deliberate, but not everything had been erased. Something remained, and that meant something or someone was still using it. They moved forward, careful to avoid loose debris that could give away their position. As they approached what had once been a market square, Shade held up a hand, signaling Katrina to stop. The ground ahead of them, disturbed. Not decades-old decay. Recent movement, boot prints. Not just one set, several. Katrina crouched, running her fingers along the imprints in the dust and soot. They were fresh, no more than a day old, too many to be scavengers. She glanced up at Shade, her golden eyes sharp. Draven's men? Shade nodded. Or someone else who shouldn't be here. That changed things. This wasn't just a forgotten ruin, it was an active zone. That meant danger. And then they saw it. Half buried beneath the wreckage of an old archway was a body. Shade crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning the corpse for anything out of place. The fallen guard lay sprawled on his back, his armor scorched and partially melted. The wound was clean, too clean. A single deep slash across the chest, the edges burned as if cauterized instantly. No blood pooled around him, just the scent of charred fabric and flesh. Katrina knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against the singed edges of the wound. This wasn't a normal blade, she murmured. Something magical did this. Probably enchanted. Shade nodded, his expression dark. Draven posted a guard here, which means he still cares about this place, but someone got to him first. His gaze swept the area, the shadows of the ruins deep and shifting in the dim light. And they might still be around. Katrina examined the corpse further, checking the guard's belt and pockets. No coin purse, she noted. His weapon is missing too. Whoever did this didn't just kill him, they looted him. Shade exhaled sharply. Then they weren't just here to kill, they were looking for something. His fingers traced the edges of the burn wound. The precision? This wasn't a struggle, it was an execution. Katrina's gaze flickered toward the distant silhouette of Draven's fortress, the towering spires still partially visible beyond the ruins. If someone's been through here, we might not be the only ones trying to reach Draven's stronghold. Shade straightened, his eyes narrowing. Then we move, quietly. We'll follow the old supply paths, see if anyone else left tracks heading toward the fortress. Katrina gave one last glance to the dead guard before rising to her feet. Let's hope we're not walking into an ambush. Without another word, the two of them slipped into the ruins' shadows, their steps silent as they began their approach toward Draven's fortress. They moved through the ruins with measured steps, their instincts honed for any sign of movement. The unnatural silence of Eldermire only reinforced their suspicions. Whoever had taken out Draven's guard was still out there, and possibly watching. The mist curled around their feet as they advanced toward the path leading to Draven's fortress. The jagged remains of Eldermire's structures stood as eerie sentinels, casting long broken shadows under the dim light filtering through the darkened sky. Katrina flexed her fingers, her body tensed, every nerve on edge. They kept low, using the rubble and overgrowth to stay concealed. The fortress loomed in the distance, its dark spires and thick walls a foreboding sight against the swirling storm clouds gathering above. As they drew closer, Katrina signaled for a stop and pointed toward a cluster of dead trees lining the path. Shade followed her gaze and spotted the faint glimmer of something metallic wedged between the roots of a fallen trunk. They approached carefully, every step deliberate, until Katrina crouched down to retrieve it. A dagger, small, sleek, and of an unfamiliar make. She turned it over in her palm, studying the hilt. This is crafted, designed for precision. Shade frowned, his mind racing through the possibilities. We need to keep moving, he said, his tone urgent but controlled. Whoever they are, they had a reason for taking out that guard. We need to find out what before they come after us. The air was thick with the scent of charred stone and old magic, remnants of Draven's destruction lingering like ghosts in the ruins. The night sky was barely visible through the swirling mist, casting eerie shadows against the cracked stone and overgrown rubble. Shade and Katrina moved in absolute silence, their training making them spectres of the night. But they weren't alone. Katrina felt it first, a presence, like a whisper just out of reach, watching, waiting. She wasn't the only predator here. Katrina's grip tightened on the hilt of her silver katana, its enchanted edge humming faintly against the air. Shade, ever the tactician, remained composed, adjusting his stance with his two-handed greatsword, enchanted by Eli to cut through dark magic. Then, movement, a flicker in the ruins, barely perceptible. Most wouldn't have caught it, but Katrina wasn't most. She moved in an instant, silent as death, slipping between the wreckage and shifting into the darkness of the crumbling archways. Shade followed, eyes narrowing. A breath of wind, a shift in the air. Then, the unmistakable ring of steel. Katrina's blade met another with blinding speed, sparks flying as she clashed against twin silver swords, one burning with fire, the other humming with frost. Lyra had been tracking them, and she wasn't playing nice. The clash sent a shockwave through the air, but instead of pressing the attack, Lyra disengaged, flipping backward with unnatural grace, landing effortlessly on the crumbling ruins. Lyra's golden hair caught the dim light, a striking contrast against the ruined landscape. Her piercing blue eyes flicked between Katrina and Shade, assessing, calculating. That technique, that's Nithorian, isn't it? Lyra mused, her voice a smooth purr. She twirled one of her blades idly, the fire-kissed steel casting flickering embers into the cold night air. "And here I thought your kind were extinct." Katrina said nothing, her katana held firm. Shade, standing a step behind her, didn't lower his weapon either. Lyra's smirk widened as she shifted her stance, her other blade's icy glow pulsing faintly. "I've heard whispers of someone like you before," she continued, tilting her head at Shade. "But that was a long time ago. So tell me, are you a legend, or just another dead man walking?" Shade remained silent, his expression unreadable. Katrina, however, didn't share his patience. She took a measured step forward, her voice low and edged with warning. "Who are you, and why are you following us?" Lyra placed a delicate hand over her heart in mock offense. "Following?" "Oh no, darling, tracking. There's a difference." She flicked her blades in a slow flourish, the fire and ice reflecting off the jagged ruins around them. "See, I don't take well to uninvited guests wandering through Eldermire. Too many scavengers, too many fools thinking they can pick the bones of this place without consequence." Shade's fingers curled around the hilt of his great sword. "And which are you? The scavenger or the fool?" Lyra's laughter rang through the ruins, sharp and amused. "Oh, I like you. You're fun." Her eyes darted to Katrina. "Not sure about your friend here, though. She looks ready to slit my throat just for breathing near her." Katrina didn't flinch. "Give me a reason not to." Lyra's grin didn't fade, but there was a glint of something darker beneath it now. Now, don't be hasty. If I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this lovely conversation." Shade's patience was wearing thin. "Then what do you want?" Lyra sighed theatrically. "Straight to business, then?" "Fine. I want to know why two Shadow Walkers are sneaking through a dead city like this. Nithorians are supposed to be locked up in their realm." Katrina and Shade exchanged a glance. Lyra caught it, and she smiled. "Oh, now that is interesting," she murmured. "You do have a reason, and it's something big." Her grip on her swords tightened, and her playful demeanor shifted, just slightly. "Well then," she purred, stepping forward, her blades held loosely at her sides. "Let's see how much you're willing to bleed to keep it a secret." Katrina shifted, her stance coiled like a viper ready to strike. The air between her and Lyra was razor-thin, charged with the unspoken promise of violence. Lyra saw it, felt it, and she thrived on it. Her smirk deepened, her twin blades dipping ever so slightly, an unspoken challenge. Katrina didn't hesitate. She moved like a phantom, her katana flashing in the dim light as she lunged, her strike aimed with lethal precision. But she never connected. A clang rang through the ruins as Shade's greatsword blocked her strike at the last second, his blade locking against hers with just enough force to hold her back without turning it into an attack. Katrina's eyes snapped to Shade in disbelief, her fury barely restrained. "She's playing with us," she hissed. Shade didn't deny it. He could see the amusement still dancing in Lyra's eyes. But there was something else there too. Recognition. The way she had reacted to Katrina's movement, the way she had assessed them so quickly. It wasn't just skill. It was knowledge. He wasn't about to waste that. "We're not here to waste time fighting ghosts," Shade said, his voice even. "You clearly know more than you're letting on. Nythoria isn't exactly common knowledge these days." Lyra tilted her head, watching him curiously. Then she sheathed her swords in a single fluid motion, a sign of confidence rather than surrender. "Clever," she murmured. "You see the bigger picture. I respect that." Katrina didn't lower her blade. "You're stalling." Lyra met her gaze, unbothered. "And you're predictable." Her attention slid back to Shade. "But he's right. I do know a thing or two about Nythoria. Enough to know that if you're here, in this place, you're chasing something dangerous." Shade finally lowered his greatsword, his posture still tense but no longer aggressive. "Tell us what you know." Lyra grinned, taking a step closer, deliberately invading his space as if testing his limits. "Oh, sweetheart," she purred. "Information comes at a price." Katrina scoffed, shifting back into a guarded stance. "You think we're just going to pay you for whatever scraps you decide to throw us?" Lyra's expression turned calculating. "No," she admitted. "I think you're going to make a deal." Shade studied her, his mind working fast. Lyra wasn't just a rogue assassin. She was a strategist, a survivor. If she knew about Nythoria, if she recognized their abilities, that meant she had history, and history could be leveraged. "What do you want?" he asked. Lyra's grin turned sharp, all teeth and hidden daggers. "Oh, it's simple, really," she said, circling them like a prowling cat. "You let me tag along, and in return, I don't kill you." Katrina let out a low growl of frustration. "You really expect us to trust you?" Lyra stopped, meeting her gaze head-on. "Not at all," she winked. "But I expect you to realize that an extra pair of skilled hands might just tip the scales in your favor." She looked at Shade then, her expression unreadable. "Especially when you're walking straight into his domain." Shade's jaw tightened. Katrina's grip on her sword flexed. And just like that, the game had changed. The ruins of Eldermire stood in eerie silence, the echoes of the past thick in the air. Shade and Katrina had tread carefully, their mission clear. But now, standing face to face with Lyra, the mission had just become complicated. Katrina's silver katana was still half raised, the tension in her stance a promise rather than a warning. She wasn't the type to posture, she finished fights. And right now, her blade was whispering that Lyra was an inconvenience best dealt with quickly. Shade read the air between them and stepped forward before the tension could ignite into violence. "You know something," he said, his voice low, controlled. Lyra's grin didn't waver, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something measured. "I know many things, handsome." Her gaze flicked back to Katrina, amusement sparking in her eyes. "And I know that if she had her way, I'd already be in pieces." Katrina's tone was flat. "Keep talking." Lyra let out a low chuckle. "Draven's not just collecting artifacts. He's been moving between realms, specifically yours." She nodded toward Katrina. "Nythoria." Shade's fingers flexed against the hilt of his sword. Katrina's expression remained unreadable, but Shade could see the slight shift in her grip. Her mind was already working. Lyra continued, circling slightly, though she kept her hands away from her weapons. "Voidstone, to be exact. He's been stockpiling it. Whatever he's planning, he's been using your realm to do it. Katrina finally lowered her blade a fraction, but her eyes locked onto Lyra's like a steel trap. How do you know that? Lyra smirked. Because I make it my business to know. A flicker of something cold passed through Katrina's gaze. She's been watching Nythoria while I've been reclaiming my own identity. Shade watched the two carefully. Katrina never let a threat live, but Lyra wasn't begging for her life. She was offering something. And she was right about one thing. They needed more intel before making their next move. Shade exhaled sharply. You want in? Lyra grinned. Sharp one, aren't you? Katrina turned toward Shade, and her meaning was clear. This is a mistake. Shade met her gaze steadily, then looked back at Lyra. You try anything, and she'll kill you before you take your next breath. Lyra's smirk widened, as if she were enjoying the threat. Darling, I'd be disappointed if she didn't. Katrina sheathed her blade, but there was no mistaking the lethal promise in her eyes. Lyra took that as an agreement and stepped closer, dusting off her armor as if she hadn't just been inches from death. Well then, she said smoothly, shall we? The uneasy alliance was struck. And just like that, the hunt for Draven had another player. Shade and Katrina were mere shadows in the ruins, their forms shifting seamlessly between the broken walls as they approached the outskirts of Draven's fortress. Even from a distance, Katrina could see that Lyra had been telling the truth. She knew this place. Her movements were calculated, leading them through the maze of collapsed stone and overgrown paths without hesitation. This is one of the old smuggling routes, Lyra whispered, walking with a confident stride, her hands resting lightly on the hilts of her twin swords. Draven used it to move contraband, weapons, and people without drawing attention. Katrina barely glanced at her. Convenient, Lyra smirked. Very. Shade, however, wasn't focused on their banter. He had been quiet for the last several minutes, watching, sensing. Something was off. That's when he saw them. Through the mist, a group of Draven's men had set up a temporary camp near a ruined watchtower, 7 in total. Rough-looking enforcers, all heavily armed. They weren't stationed like guards, but rather, they appeared to be waiting for something. Katrina made an immediate assessment. We go around. Shade nodded. This is recon. We stay unseen. But Lyra's expression lit up like she had just been given a gift. 7 men, sitting around bored. How could I possibly resist? Katrina's head snapped toward her. We don't engage. Lyra winked at her. You don't engage. Before Katrina could grab her, Lyra was already moving. She sauntered forward, shifting her posture from that of a lethal predator to something looser, more playful. In a matter of seconds, she had transformed, not just in movement, but in presence. The air around her changed as she approached the group like a wandering traveller, her hands raised in a gesture of false innocence. One of the men spotted her and stiffened. Oi, what's this? Lyra let out a sultry laugh, flipping her golden hair over one shoulder. Now, boys, she cooed, you're all out here alone, looking so bored. She took slow, calculated steps closer, her stance designed to disarm, to mislead. 2 of them were already shifting, glancing at each other, caught between suspicion and intrigue. Shade muttered a curse under his breath. We're stopping this, Katrina said coldly, already moving. But before they could, Lyra struck. With a flick of her wrist, her fire blade sliced across the throat of the closest man, the second blade of ice burying itself in another's chest before he could even react. Blood splattered the stone as she whirled into motion, a blur of deadly elegance. The remaining 5 exploded into action, but they were slow. Too slow. Shade and Katrina had no choice. They moved in tandem, silent and efficient. Katrina's katana slashed across a man's midsection, severing his spine. Shade's greatsword cleaved through another, his movements precise and powerful. The last man turned to run. Katrina threw a knife. The blade embedded in his back, and he collapsed with a strangled gasp. For a long moment there was only silence. Katrina turned on Lyra, eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell was that?" she hissed, stepping into Lyra's space. "Do you realize what you've just done? If one of them got away—" "They didn't," Lyra purred, wiping the blood from her blades with practiced ease. "You're welcome." Shade exhaled slowly, his grip on his sword tightening. He had expected Lyra to be reckless, but this was dangerous. That was unnecessary. Lyra leaned in, giving him a slow smile. "You two were going to let them go. You're lucky I was here." Katrina let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "We had a plan. This isn't a game." Lyra tilted her head. "Oh, but it is. And you're just upset that I played it better." Katrina's jaw clenched. She was seconds from running Lyra through. Shade took a step forward, his voice low. "Enough." He looked between them, his expression unreadable. "We move before someone notices the bodies." Katrina took a breath, forcing herself to step back. Shade was right. The mission came first. Lyra smirked, twirling one of her swords before sheathing it. "See? You do need me." Katrina didn't answer. But as they moved deeper into the ruins, she watched Lyra, her mind already calculating. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.